Good morning, everyone.
Awesome. I think we're set. Thank you so much for being here. We have a tight schedule today, so I'm going to jump in. I know there's going to be folks joining still, but thank you. A few housekeeping notes. One, we are recording this session, so if you could please make sure your cell phones are off, just so that we're not dealing with distractions. Two, please feel free to tweet. You all know how to do that. The hashtag for the conference is ACS 2024. Done. For folks who are seeking CLE credit, you might all be pros by now, but just as a reminder, you're going to need 2 codes to enter into the form. I will read the first one now, which is Spellman, Spellman, and I'll give the second code during the session. There's going to be a microphone for Q&A. We're going to reserve about 15 minutes at the end. So when we get there, you'll see our microphone captain. If you raise your hand, they'll come to you. And we will go from there. If you could please keep your questions short and questions, that would be really helpful. That way we can make sure we get through as many as we can in the short amount of time. All right, all the housekeeping's done. With that, I'm going to briefly introduce our panelists. I encourage you, their full bios are linked on the website. They have incredible careers, each one of them. There's lots to discuss there. But for shortness of time, I'm just going to give their title for now. So to my immediate left is Anya Marino. She is the Director of LGBTQI Equality at the National Women's Law Center. To her left is Rabia Mukaddem. She is the Senior Staff Attorney at the Center for Reproductive Rights. And then finally, rounding us out is Professor Jessie Hill. She is the Judge Ben C. Green Professor of Law and Associate Dean for Research and Faculty Development at Case Western Reserve University. Got through that one. That one's the tongue twister. All right, now it's easy. So to start, I'm going to just dive right in so that we can get through as much as possible because we have so much to cover in this session. So Anya, to start us off, we have seen a wave of anti-trans legislation sweep all over the country, not just the South. Would you please describe the types of legislation that we're seeing in this wave?
Sure, and I want to start by kind of taking a step back and just acknowledge that we're seeing increasing hostilities across the entire country, particularly over the last 5 years. And trans people need only overhear the news, scroll through clickbait media, hear vicious remarks from politicians, and encounter personal issues of differential treatment and harassment to reasonably feel like they're suffocating. The legislative and administrative action targeting trans and non-binary people is pretty wide, and there's a lot of variety. So we see a lot of surveillance and body policing through bills that narrowly define who women are and criminalize our ability to use restrooms consistent with our affirmed genders. And we also see this happening through examples of exclusive sports programs. There are also bills that endeavor to censor trans and non-binary people, and that can be seen also through regulations and local government action that erases our history and our stories by prohibiting certain topics of discussion in education and programming, and also by banning access to books and other media in school and public libraries. We also see threats to family separation. One example of that would be, of course, what we saw in Texas, where providing access to essential health care was characterized as child abuse. And we also see the elimination or restriction of life-saving and essential medical care for trans and non-binary people who require to have any chance of thriving.
I want to ask one more kind of level-setting question for the conversation. Sure. We hear the term gender-affirming care a lot. I think there's maybe a little confusion sometimes in those conversations of what that actually involves. So could you briefly describe what does it mean when we say gender-affirming care?
Sure. So gender-affirming care refers to a type of healthcare that is indeed essential for trans non-binary individuals, and it's required to, or rather, it may be required to treat gender dysphoria. So let's take an additional step back and discuss what gender dysphoria is, because not everyone knows. Gender dysphoria is a discordance that trans and non-binary people experience between their sex assigned at birth and their gender identity. Which is, of course, an internal sense of being a man, a woman, or being neither. Gender dysphoria is a medical condition. And continuing studies into the condition suggest a physical etiology to the condition that develops during in utero brain development. Indeed, brain imaging illustrates certain differences in trans and cis people's brains. When left untreated, gender dysphoria can substantially limit an individual's activities, and it can lead to conditions like depression and anxiety or other serious conditions. And the widely accepted treatment for gender dysphoria is gender-affirming care. So gender-affirming care involves a variety of modalities and depends on the trans or non-binary person's needs. It can involve counseling and talk therapy to address one's dysphoria, social affirmation, which involves using pronouns and titles aligning with an individual's affirmed gender, correcting one's name and gender marker to align with one's affirmed gender, and dressing and expressing oneself in a manner consistent with one's affirmed gender. It can also involve medical affirmation to align one's body and one's gender. And there are 3 different components of that medical treatment. The first is hormone therapy, which may involve the provision of cross-sex hormones, the elimination of an individual's endogenous hormonal production, the stalling of endogenous puberty, typically in Tanner stage 2, and in some instances, a combination of these different types of hormone therapy. There is also surgical care to align an individual's primary and secondary characteristics with their gender. And then finally, reproductive care, including fertility treatments, are also a component of gender-affirming care.
Thank you so much.
Sure.
To bring Rabia into the conversation, at the same time that we've seen this wave of anti-trans, not only legislation, but just attacks, we've seen a parallel race to the bottom to access abortion care in conservative states, mostly. Could you please describe the types of limiting legislation we're seeing on that front?
Sure. Can you hear me? So I think what we're seeing is Christian nationalism in all of its heinous forms, and that has motivated this sort of race to the bottom that you're talking about. So we all knew that when Dobbs was decided, this was not the end, this was the beginning. Anti-abortion extremists have used numerous levers beyond their traditional approaches in order to continue to restrict abortion where it remains, and to restrict people who are accessing medication abortion in their own states. So right now, there's a few different forms of healthcare going on in this environment where there is some states where abortion is all but illegal and other states where it is accessible or even protected. So we're starting to see a few really alarming developments in the use of legal levers to come after both forms of care. One is the use of the courts to try and achieve nationwide relief that impacts abortion access all over the country. So we've seen that in the Alliance for Hippocratic Medicine case, which is attempting to use the Administrative Procedure Act to eliminate access to mifepristone, one of the safest drugs available on the market, and also what is commonly known as the abortion pill. Another version of this is the litigation that's going on in the Supreme Court around EMTALA. EMTALA for 40 years has been understood to require abortion care where a patient needs to be stabilized where their pregnancy itself is causing an emergency medical condition. Why is this a controversy now? Dobbs. And I think we're also seeing the advent of some pretty heinous laws targeting minors. So Idaho and now Tennessee passed what they call minor trafficking laws, which are essentially designed to isolate minors who need to travel for abortion care in their states by preventing them from accessing practical support. And then we are seeing all manner of other restrictions designed to come after those who are helping people in banned states access care. So you may have seen Louisiana enacting a law that makes mifepristone a controlled substance in Louisiana. We've also seen threats from Arkansas's Attorney General against people who are mailing medication abortion. To be honest, the anti-abortion extremists are extremely frustrated that they have not found anyone to prosecute. So they are attempting to implement all these sort of really fringe ideas to try and find information and people to prosecute. So those are a set of actions that ban states are using to come after access that exists elsewhere. But I'll just emphasize that in a future hostile administration that shall not be named, because we are a 501c3, there are so many levers that they will pull. Yeah. And I think, as you've probably read, Project 2025 from the Heritage Foundation provides a roadmap. In that roadmap is the idea that the Comstock laws can be used to effect a nationwide abortion ban that would not have to go to the voters or through Congress. So I think what we are seeing now are the fringe has become mainstream, and Dobbs was the match that lit the flame a bit.
Can I ask briefly for you to describe, because maybe not everybody in the room knows, what is the Comstock Act, just to put a little meat on that bone?
The Comstock laws were created after their namesake, Anthony Comstock. They are anti-sex Victorian-era purity statutes. Anthony Comstock was a mega creep who opposed sex pretty much in all its forms. He was a misogynist. He was a racist. And he designed the laws, among other things, to encourage white women, white Protestant women, to have children, and to discourage those who did not fall in that category, people of color, and pretty much everybody else from having children. He also opposed just pleasure, the idea of pleasure, the idea of people literally enjoying themselves doing anything other than being a total creep. So he, invented these laws. He used the Postal Service to try and come after people who were mailing materials that he deemed offensive, which was pretty much all materials, I guess, except the Bible. I don't know. So he used these laws to try and kind of eliminate speech, conduct, all of these things that were sort of offensive to him. It's important to note that in 100 and some years that the Comstock laws have been in existence, they have never been applied in that way. They have never been applied to come after lawful abortion services, even when, before Roe had been decided. So the idea that these laws can be misused in this way today, I think it's just a perfect example of how truly fringe legal ideas have come to the fore, because anti-abortion extremists they think blood is in the water. Dobbs has unleashed them, empowered them to do what they, expect. And I think in Alliance, we're going to see potentially 2 justices of the Supreme Court of the United States co-sign this Comstock theory in a dissent. So that is deeply troubling.
It was so interesting during oral argument, they didn't want to use the term Comstock. It was like the code was given, which I think speaks in part to how unpopular it actually is as a position. As you mentioned, it's a fringe idea that they've moved to the center, in part kind of through trickery. Thank you. Rabia, I want to now bring Professor Hill in. Thank you for your patience. As both of these areas of care are kind of swept up in the culture wars, advocates in several states have focused on kind of bypassing state legislatures, as we know often are gerrymandered and otherwise unrepresentative of the actual voters in their states, and taking that question directly to voters when possible. You are in the great state of Ohio, yes. And I was hoping you might speak a little bit to how Issue 1 went down in Ohio and what we might learn from that.
Absolutely. One of my favorite topics. So, for those of you who don't know, Issue 1 in Ohio was a ballot initiative that was voted on in November of 2023, in which Ohioans voted by an overwhelming margin to enshrine the right to make one's own reproductive decisions into the Ohio Constitution. It included abortion explicitly, as well as other reproductive decisions like contraception, fertility care, miscarriage management, and, including but not limited to those things. So, I think that there's a lot to be said about this, and believe me, I could talk about it all day. And one thing I do think is important is what you said, that kind of drawing on the theme from the opening plenary, that Ohio had a 6-week ban that went into effect the day the Dobbs decision came down. And it really was an example of, folks in a mostly red state taking matters into our own hands and really taking back our power from a gerrymandered legislature. So it was an incredible moment in that sense. But I think, and Ohio was the first sort of red state, abortion hostile state to codify affirmative protections for abortion rights into the state constitution. And, hopefully we'll see more of that in November of this year in other states. But the other thing is, I think there are things about the Issue 1 campaign that really show how the fights for bodily autonomy with respect to reproductive rights and LGBTQIA rights are really intertwined. And of course, both, as Rabia and Anya have been saying, both of these kinds of attacks that have been happening are attacks on people's bodily autonomy, right to control their own bodies, policing, their attempts to police bodies, right? But I think we really saw it in Issue 1 because one of the things during the ballot initiative campaign, now Issue 1 spoke to reproductive decisions. It didn't specifically call out things like gender affirming care, but could be read broadly enough to include, and can be read broadly enough to include certain kinds of, I think, gender affirming care. But the attack from the anti-Issue 1 folks was, one of the major lines of attack was, this is about letting minors get gender affirming surgeries without parental consent. And that was a huge talking point on the other side, which is just kind of silly for a lot of reasons, frankly, that was somehow what this was about. I mean, there were focus groups where people were convinced that Planned Parenthood was raising money in order to pay for really expensive gender affirming surgeries for minors so that, they could get them without their parents' consent or involvement. It just kind of demonstrates this strategy of creating a moral sexual panic around people having control over their own bodies and about stigmatizing and attacking the most vulnerable people. And I think for the most part, those attacks, obviously they didn't get far enough. People didn't really buy them, I'm happy to say, in Ohio. But as soon as the ban passed, as soon as Issue 1 passed, the folks who had opposed it were very upset, and they needed to take it out on someone, and their base was very upset and needed some red meat. And within weeks of Issue 1 passing, our legislature turned around and passed a ban on gender affirming care for minors, and also a ban on trans kids participating in sports. And so that those laws fortunately have been enjoined, at least for now. The litigation is ongoing in Ohio, but it's exactly the same playbook from the perspective of the other side. And so with respect to both kinds of issues, and I think we need to think on our side more about also kind of coordinating around those issues.
Can I add just a little bit to that?
Please,
So, because Ohio is a very interesting example of how we see the overlap between reproductive justice and gender affirming care. And notwithstanding the legislative movements that were made in order to eliminate access to care for specifically trans and non-binary minors, there were also a series of administrative regulations that were proposed to also either eliminate care in its entirety or to restrict care for both adults and minors. And several of us across the country have been involved in responding during the notice and comment period to explain why these regulations would indeed be harmful. And among them, we see the ways in which they're trying to restrict care, which mirrors a lot of the ways that we've seen them try to restrict abortion care, where one can receive these types of care, the healthcare workers who are able to administer this care, the types of clinics that are able to provide this care. It's the same playbook.
Yeah, absolutely.
I might add just there is actually some truth to the fact that abortion providers are often also providers of gender affirming care. Why is that? Because they provide the essential services their communities need, even though it's hard because nobody else will do it. and they are willing to take on a lot of legal risk, which many healthcare providers typically aren't. So I think this opportunity, well, it is an opportunity to integrate, I think, both advocacy, our legal thinking. Abortion and gender affirming care are both life-saving. They're both essential. They are essential for people to thrive, to survive. And so I hope that we can continue to integrate both from the health, leading our healthcare providers are leading us, and to follow their example.
But I will say that one of the things that I think our opposition is very effective at doing is trying to drive a wedge between the broader gender justice movement and those of us who are advocating for access to healthcare for those who are trans and non-binary. And it's even broader even than healthcare. It spans the entire panoply of rights that trans and non-binary people are seeking on a daily basis.
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
I'm going to take a second in this pause to give the second CLE code. Thank you for your patience. The second CLE code is Morehouse, Morehouse. If you have questions, there's volunteers in the back if you didn't hear me for any reason, but thank you. All right, not to disrupt us too much. I want to follow up on what we were just talking about, and it's okay if we've already covered it, but I want to give space for any additional thoughts on where the progressive movement can improve on making this an intersectional
In so many ways.
advocacy. Yes.
Oh my God, so many ways.
And so I know we've already touched on it, but I want us to kind of get into that conversation because I think that it's important for all of us to take that with us out of this room, is ways that we can be better working together.
Well, I just want to jump on. I know you're going to say something too, Anya, but what you just said, which was like, this attempt to drive a wedge and the real need to coordinate on strategy, it's huge. And I did that, again, we got this amendment and then there was an immediate, just sort of backlash attack on trans youth. And then the litigation that followed really like, there was a lot of thinking about what kinds of claims do we bring, I think to some extent the attack on gender affirming care was an attempt to bait the trans rights, the litigators in that case toward bringing a claim under the new amendment and saying, see, we told you, as a way of like undermining then what might happen in the reproductive rights litigation that would follow. And so, and again, not to say that there's one right answer to this, but there were other, strong claims. And so there were decisions made around, what sorts of claims to bring in that litigation, but you also want to make sure you're doing it in a way that isn't right one group throwing the other group under the bus. And I think that's kind of where we are right now. I think that there's going to be room for much longer term and bigger intersectional thinking that is still just kind of in the process, right, of happening, at least, from my perspective at the state level, and much more to be done. But
I know we both have a lot of things to say. Did you want to go first? Or?
Well, I do want to emphasize one thing, which I think was so important that Anya opened with, which is for those of us who advocate for reproductive health, I think we all need to achieve a very comfortable fluency in what gender affirming care is, who gets it and who provides it. That is something I see a lot, that there's just still a little bit of a knowledge gap because the mental construction is that these two things are separate. And I think what Professor Hill articulated, that both of these are essential forms of bodily autonomy and threats to bodily autonomy. And I think that has to be our touchstone. But if we're going to make that a reality, I think we have to expand our own knowledge and understanding beyond our traditional fields.
I would echo all of those comments. Another thing that I would say is those of us who are engaging in the advocacy need to be really responsible about the potential claims that we're bringing in cases that challenge bans to gender affirming care specifically. I think a lot of times we are frequently playing into a strategy that conservative extremists have laid, specifically concerning certain claims around parental rights that are deeply concerning to those of us who also engage in abortion care and reproductive justice advocacy. And there are many reasons why parental rights claims are also extremely detrimental to LGBTQI plus youth, even beyond the ways in which they're being framed for challenges to categorical bans of gender affirming care.
Can I
Yes,
just also jump in with like another big picture kind of thought? And I think this is about this particular intersection of movements, but also about sort of progressive legal movements in general, which is that like I feel like we could share information a lot more than we do among ourselves, and that we've really been hampered by a sort of defensive feeling of needing to, be worried about infiltrators, which is real, right? I mean, it's not, especially in spaces like repro, which I'm most familiar with, like there's legitimate reasons to fear. But at the same time, like I think on the other side, they share information, they go public, they do this, they talk about legal strategy in forums like this. They put out a 900-page treatise, a manifesto on what they plan to do and how they plan to do it when they take back power. And like, we don't, they get a lot of benefits from that. They get a lot of like brain power thinking about these things. They get, it helps make these ideas mainstream. And I think we all could be doing more information sharing in careful and thoughtful ways, but, a little bit more than we do right now.
I want to follow up on that because a ton of what is driving, and it's already been referenced, this conservative thinking, we'll call it, has been the both weaponization of kind of parental rights, but also conscious objections and claims to free exercise of religion in a way that purposely pits that against life-saving healthcare. You already mentioned Rabia. Alliance Defending Freedom is the group bringing one particular case in front of the Supreme Court right now, but they're bringing a lot of litigation all over the place on both of these issues. They've been aggressive in trying to defeat access. What do you make of this trend, and how does religion play a role? Maybe we can do a little work in just kind of bringing that to the forefront and not letting it be an assumed part of the conversation.
You want to go? Yeah, I was just going to say that I think take a look at ADF's website sometime, and you will be left with the unmistakable impression that this is a Christian nationalist attempt to turn the United States into a certain type of Christian nation, and to use the law to achieve that and to implement their view of what the Bible requires. If my mother was here, she would say, these people don't understand Jesus at all. So this is not, this is not everybody, right? It's a particular idea of Christianity, and it's the idea that you can impose that on every single person, regardless of how they feel, who they are, and what they want to do with their own lives. So these things are, I think, the same to me. They are equivalent. And I remember during the previous hostile administration, that administration implemented something we called the denial of care rule, which was a so-called conscience statute. But in argument before Judge Engelmeyer in the Southern District of New York, the attorney for the administration basically said, yeah, anyone can turn away a trans person if they object to their existence. Doesn't matter if they're seeking gender-affirming care. Yes, an ambulance driver can drop off a woman in the middle of Central Park if he thinks that she's going to receive an abortion at the hospital. These things are all connected because the way that they get to the things that they want to attack, it's all based in this Christian nationalist idea. And thus, to them, all of this is tied together. I think we are the people who are a little bit more siloed. And so to me, those things are basically identical.
So a few things that I would add to that are it is a Christian nationalist idea, but it's most specifically a white Christian nationalist idea. And a lot of their framework predates even this country's existence, where we saw settlers who were coming over from Europe using the color of people's skin, gender expansive expression, the acknowledgement of women in power as reasons to characterize natives in different communities as primitive and needing to essentially conform to very specific and rigid ideas of gender based on what the church believed at that time. And we saw entire communities of people eliminated based on the idea that their life and liberty could be deprived simply because they operated differently from this very conservative way of thinking. We see this consistently arise over and over and over again throughout American history, and frequently it's in instances where there is more visibility to groups have been historically marginalized, especially when it comes to LGBTQI plus people. So we saw this a lot during the Harlem Renaissance when a lot of LGBTQI plus people were living open and outwardly in places like Harlem, Chicago, San Francisco, Greenwich Village. And it prompted a lot of pathologizing of LGBTQI plus identities. Perhaps one of the clearest examples of that would be J. Edgar Hoover, who referenced LGBTQI plus people generally as psychopathic sexuals. And that pathology has continued into the present, where all LGBTQI plus people are seen as requiring care, but not care that is affirming and acknowledges the authenticity of their existence, a type of care that is endeavoring to erase their existence and make them conform to a very specific way in which conservatives perceive power structures.
Go ahead.
I was just going to add something on the sort of what conscience has done as a legal matter. They're using it, of course, think about 303 Creative as a way of denying services and all manner of things to others. One of the alarming things I see is now the use of just conscience as a way of either generating legal standing or as a basis for denying grant conditions. So they're using conscience in all sorts of ways that are beyond like an individual objection to providing a healthcare service.
Right.
So like in Alliance for Hippocratic Medicine, one of the main points that they are making is that, although it never actually happened to them, if you read their declarations, that they are treating patients who they would not be treating, and those patients providing that care is a violation of their conscience. That's like a huge generator of their standing arguments, which is bananas. But obviously has an open ear on the Supreme Court, at least in some of the justices. Just deeply, deeply disturbing.
And we see states that oppose access to these forms of care adopting these arguments in specific challenges, most recently to, as an example, the 1557 rule drop, the Title IX rule drop, and the EEOC enforcement guidance, all of which acknowledge that sex discrimination also encompasses discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity. And the states are frequently arguing in these cases, well, requiring us as employers or the administrators of educational programs or requiring us to enforce these regulations or to comport to these regulations violate potential individual freedoms to practice one's faith. And in specific instances, when we're talking about employment or education, they say that it also triggers free expression claims as well for individuals who are either attending school or working in schools or working in workplaces as well.
So and then I just want to not forget to raise the point from the other side that of course there are conscience claims on both sides of this these issues, right? And we have started to see litigation raising religious freedom objections and religious freedom claims in response to abortion bans in various states, and it's hard to say where that's going to all end up. And, most of it is in state court. I mean, if it were to end up before the U.S. Supreme Court, I'd be very skeptical that it's going to win in front of the U.S. Supreme Court that we have. But a lot of it is moving at the state court level. And I just want to suggest that also it may be a good strategy, because I think actually this litigation maybe creating a sort of wedge on the other side, because all of the groups that have traditionally been aligned on religious freedom litigation don't necessarily all agree on the conditions under which abortions are not the conscientiously, religiously, morally acceptable. And so I think that, although we haven't seen it to a great degree, I think, it's worth pushing. It's worth pushing these claims because they're worth making and they're legitimate. But it's also worth pushing them because I think it is pushing the folks who haven't had to really confront this problem before into a bit of a quandary, and recognizing that conscience and religion, writ large, is not monolithic on this issue, and it really highlights that from all angles. So I think that's one hopeful development on the conscience and religious front.
I want to ask about spillover effects. We've talked about gender affirming care. We've talked about abortion care. Those two areas of care obviously don't encompass the entirety of someone's existence as they move through and the way that their bodies are policed. And so are we seeing an effect on both legislation and litigation that is creating kind of increased policing of bodies spill over into other parts of life?
So the short answer to that is yes. I think the attacks that we see against trans and non-binary people in all components of public life exemplify this. So we see legislation at the state, local, and word up to a party at the federal level that endeavor to eliminate access to opportunities for trans and non-binary people in education, in employment, in healthcare, in housing, in all areas of life, in an effort to erase their very existence. And it's frightening. It leaves many community members reasonably feeling like they're suffocating. And I think what's essential to acknowledge, given the way that all of these attacks are happening, is how they are all interrelated and how it does indeed come down to policing our bodies. But also critical is acknowledging how a lot of these policies that are anti-trans and non-binary impact cis women and girls, particularly cis women and girls of color. And we see increases in violence against all women and girls based on these anti-trans policies. So as an example, unfortunately, Michelle Dion Peacock, who was a Black woman living in Richmond, Indiana, was horrifically slaughtered by one of her neighbors because he believed that she was a trans woman of color. There are examples from Danbury, Connecticut, all the way to Las Vegas of women simply wanting to access bathrooms so that they can relieve themselves, much like anyone else needs to. And they are accosted quite violently in restrooms because they have short cropped hair or wear baggy clothing, or do not look the way that sex stereotypes dictate a person should look. We also see threats of violence against athletes. Perhaps one of the two most recent examples involved two student athletes in Utah, one of which unfortunately had to involve law enforcement following certain questions about her gender that were raised by a state school board official. And the reason that her gender was questioned was because she had short cropped hair, she wore baggy clothing, and she was athletic. I mean, hello, she was an athlete, so she's going to be athletic. But there is a lot of there are themes that are continuing throughout all of this around the way that all women and girls should comport themselves, and this really horrible thought that women and girls are inherently inferior to anyone who is assigned male at birth.
I think I'll also add that criminalization of pregnancy outcomes is not something that started after Dobbs. It's been true forever, and that affects Black women, Indigenous women, and other people of color. And what Dobbs has done is had the effect of accelerating that criminalization. But it has always been extremely prevalent and very negative. And I think If When How has been documenting for a very long time instances where care providers, who are most of the time the people who report people for their pregnancy outcomes, and whether or not those cases move forward, often indictments are involved. And as we all know, once you enter the criminal justice system in any way, it can really interfere with almost every aspect of your life and is incredibly dangerous for some people. And I think after Dobbs, there was this sort of talking point on the other side that, like, okay, none of these things are going to apply to the pregnant person. Like, we are not blaming the pregnant person. We're not coming after those people. And as we've seen post Dobbs, they are using all of the ways that they came after pregnant people before, such as failure to protect laws that they use to come after people who are victims of abuse. These sorts of failure to dispose of a body issues that have affected folks who have had miscarriages at home, all of those laws. And now they're just seeking to add criminal penalties for abortion. And that criminalization is going to affect BIPOC people. And those people who can travel or need to travel or who have, access to other ways to get care are not. And so the effect of both the prior and now accelerated criminalization, I think, of the pregnant person themselves is starting to happen and is making worse something that has been going on for decades, and is despite their claims, definitely accelerating and on the horizon.
Yeah, and I think the other related kind of spillover effect, not specifically criminalization, but is the other kinds of policing around, like Anya was alluding to earlier, like a family separation, taking kids away, family policing. So now with abortion bans in effect and with the sort of patchwork of laws there have been cases where somebody travels out of state to access, legal abortion care, comes back, maybe ends up, visiting the emergency room, and then the electronic records reveal that person had an abortion, and the child services gets called, for example. And so this is again like just another tool in the toolbox now post Dobbs that obviously was happening before Dobbs, but is much more much easier and much more prevalent, I think, in the face of these bans.
I'm going to take moderator's privilege for a moment. And one example, as you've all been talking, that comes to my mind, and the ways that these things intersect, is I know in Ohio, there was a law about, it was targeted at trans student athletes, but it applied to all athletes, and required not only a questionnaire about periods and all these things. And so in one place they're theoretically protecting women and girls, which we know isn't true, but is the guise under which it's happening, while exposing them to harm in another place, because now the state has your period data, and can see where that's going off your cycle. And so it just struck me as you were all speaking just how interwoven these things are.
Well, and sorry, I know we need to get to question and answers, so my apologies. Is the ways in which body policing occur, particularly when it comes to women and girls in athletics, are horrifying to me. And it's not a new practice. It's existed for as long as women and girls have been able to participate in athletic programs at all levels. Historically, even the Olympics would question women and girls who were participating in sports, particularly if they were Black or brown. They would make women and girls engage in nude parades among medical professionals to physically examine their bodies to ensure that they were who they said they were. And we're seeing a series of sex verification tests arise again, whether it comes, and they span from physical examination to affirming the last time someone had their period to also requiring genetic testing. And all of these things are so deeply intrusive and can be terribly humiliating. and increase the risk of sexual violence against women and girls when they are subject to some of these sex verification procedures.
We're ready for questions now. Ooh, and we have lots of them, which is great, but I will remind everyone, short if you can, so that we can get to as many as possible. We've got our microphone captain in the back, so I'm going to defer.
They all came up at the same time.
The middle seems great, and we'll kind of work our way around. Perfect.
First, I just want to say, thank you so much for speaking today. And you talked a lot about the intersections between working against anti-trans and anti-abortion legislation based on criminalizing and policing the body. And I wanted to see if you could speak to other ways about how bodies are criminalized in ways that have been going on for significantly longer than this new uptick in anti-trans and anti-abortion legislation, particularly the policing and surveillance and criminalization of sex workers, people who use drugs, and people living with HIV, and how a lot of these attacks have been going on for a very long time and kind of spurred a lot of the strategies we're seeing now, and what we can do in the repro and LGBTQ activism space to support and uplift these people suffering this ongoing policing.
Well, I'll say also that this is an arena in which I think the healthcare providers are leading the way. So some of the clients that I work with are sort of at the forefront of working with people who use substances in ways that I feel like our movement is way behind. And bodily autonomy means bodily autonomy, right? In all ways, even when some people might not like the way that people are exercising their bodily autonomy. So I think we have to own that and not back away. I think a lot of times we don't engage, for example, with incarcerated people who need reproductive health care.
Absolutely.
We don't engage with indigenous or immigrant communities that need reproductive health care or gender affirming care. I think we need to move forward on that and say that, yes, we support anyone who's incarcerated get any access to care that they need. We support people who use substances, no matter what their intentions are, to access abortion, to access childcare, to access obstetrical care. So, and the same goes, I think, for immigrant communities. There's a real, I don't know if it's a both sidesy thing that's just sort of hanging around from the Roe days, but I think we need to push our movements to say it means bodily autonomy for every single person. And I do think that young people have been so often cut out of this. We accepted a reality where young people needed a judicial bypass to get an abortion. We accepted that for a long, long time. And partly because of that, we now have laws that apply to minors that have no judicial bypass mechanism because it's a slippery slope. So I think we have failed communities who were already over-policed. We have failed communities who were already disproportionately subjected to the carceral system, to immigration status, criminalization, all sorts of things. So I think you're absolutely right. All of these things are related. And also, they're all instances of the way the movement has siloed some people who need care. And the criticism about those some people being white women is real, and others. And so this is a time where I think we are rebuilding, we are starting over, and we have to do it with everybody and not run away from those things.
If I could just jump in with sort of the red state perspective too, I just want to say, there's a lot of unpacking of stigma around all of these kinds of bodily decisions and groups, right, that needs to be unpacked. But I will say the same election that Ohio passed issue 1 and passed issue 2 legalizing pot, and that really in states that are less progressive kind of politically on the whole, these sort of messages about getting the government out of people's bodies and decisions and private spaces is powerful. I mean, it's got its shortcomings for sure as a progressive message, but it is something that really resonates even in red states.
Do you want to weigh in, or we can keep going?
We can keep going.
All right.
Hi, My name is Emily. I'm a recent transgender law graduate from the University of Miami. Getting the hell out of Florida. But I have a very sort of prescient, time-sensitive situation that we have right now. So I've learned on Monday that the university health system will be banning gender-affirming surgeries effective the end of this month. It's one of the only hospitals in the state of Florida that offers surgeries for transgender people. And entities within the university did not deign to tell me or other LGBT members of the student community. So I'm trying to figure out how to, in real time, I was texting someone from the medical school during this panel, is how best to deal with this situation when the university and the leaders of the university health system are trying to do this in a very clandestine way to prevent observation and university officials not notifying individuals who would be deeply impacted by this policy change. And anyone in the audience can talk to me after either.
We're talking about the University of Miami. Yes. Why don't you and I circle after the panel? Okay.
Hi, my name is Kat, they, them pronouns. So I work at this very specific niche intersection of state-church separation and LGBT rights. And one of the things that I'm really starting to struggle with dealing with is explaining to people who consider themselves secular or progressive in all other kind of situations that the anti-trans movement is a Christian nationalist movement, because I see a lot of what I refer to as hyper-rationalism of there are two genders, two sets of genitals, et cetera, et cetera. And I try to point them to resources like the Southern Poverty Law Center's whole report they did back in December about the anti-trans pseudoscience network. And I'm wondering if y'all are seeing something very similar, and how are you dealing with that in terms of opposition in progressive spaces?
So it's certainly something that we encounter quite frequently. I think one of the most challenging issues for those of us who do advance trans and non-binary rights is people really struggle of letting go of the binary and understanding that what many of us were taught at a very early age is just simply a component of a very small component of what gender actually looks like, and that there are variations in gender that can be measured. I think it's upwards of 11 ways at present. And of course, one of those ways in which we identify a person's gender is gender identity. And I think people also struggle with recognizing that there can be a discordance among the very different ways that we measure gender. And we see that playing out even in court cases. I think one of the clearest examples of that is some of the argument that we saw in the 11th Circuit around the Adams case, and this notion again that there's such a thing as biological sex. And I want to be clear that biological sex is not a medical term. It doesn't exist in medicine. It is a legislative fiction that was created to, in essence, conform people to very specific roles. And that when we actually talk about sex, again, there are up to 11 different ways that we measure it. How we reframe people's thoughts about sex, I don't have a clear answer to that. Unfortunately, it's something that I think many of us in the movement are grappling with presently, in part because we are all indoctrinated at such a very early age into this very rigid binary construct.
We're coming up on time. I think we have time for 2 more questions. So thank you for keeping it brief so that we can get one more in.
Hi, my name is Christian Patel, and I'm working at Planned Parenthood Virginia this summer. And my question is about the alliance between the feminist movement and the LGBTQ rights movement in the United States. In the United Kingdom, that alliance really never developed. So the primary model of feminism there is the trans exclusionary model, of which the most ardent advocates are trans exclusionary radical feminists, or TERFs. Those people don't really have a huge voice in the United States, but I have noticed that they're starting to crop up in a way that it seems like the beginning of something that could be larger. Do you think that they are a potential threat on the horizon, and do you think that we need to have a strategy to stop them from getting a foothold in the United States to prevent that from becoming an issue like how they became dominant in Britain?
So I just want to clarify one thing. TERFism in the United States has existed since the beginning.
It's here.
Yeah, it is here, and it's existed since queer liberation was really recognized with the Stonewall Uprising. And we saw the exclusion of trans and non-binary people very early on in queer liberation. I think it's one of the reasons why you saw Sylvia Rivera storm the stage at the 1973 Christopher Street Festival, really pleading with the crowd there to acknowledge the needs of trans and non-binary people, particularly those who are subject to the carceral system. And we've seen TERFism also be ingrained in the ways we talk about medical care specifically and about medical coverage. So, for example, Janice Raymond, who is a very well-known TERF and academic, was one of the reasons why at least we haven't seen the Department of Health and Human Services and CMS recognize that gender-affirming care is essential health care and that it should be indeed covered. And it's in part because a lot of her writings suggest that transgender people are anti-feminist and are a threat to women, to all women and girls. So it's here. It has been here. And we're going to continue seeing it as an issue. I think one of the things that really combats TERFism or other anti-trans messaging is sharing our stories and demonstrating our humanity in a way that allows people to understand us. Because the reality is most people, at least according to GLAAD Media, have yet, I think 80% of people have or rather believe that they've never encountered a trans person. Whether they have or they haven't, I don't know. 80% of people. But, I think it really does indeed involve sharing our stories. We have to be out there. We have to be brave. We have to be able to demonstrate to people our humanity.
I'm just going to add one thing, which is I unfortunately have a conversation along the lines of, so I know we're using gender neutral language, and I know that's important, but what if we turn people off who might, be focused on women? Like, aren't we sort of erasing women for some of those people? And the thing that I usually say to people, whoever they may be, is that it's a myth, right? Like, it's a myth that using gender neutral language in our complaints, for example, is going to turn off people who are otherwise supportive of us. And also, we have an opportunity to lead by showing that these things are all connected. That and I do think that there is a real intuitive desire to, among many people in the reproductive rights movement in particular, to see the use of non-gender neutral language as something that we need to cling to, as if it's something that if we go there, we're going to lose part of our supporters. And I just try to tell people that it's not true. Like, you might think that, it might seem intuitive to you, but it's actually factually not true. When we use gender neutral language in our legal papers, for example, we're not losing anybody. What we are is not erasing a whole community of people who need to be involved. So I try to push back on that as a factual matter. Like, I know you might think that, but it's actually not correct. And I think that has been helpful.
I know there's so many more questions still, and I love that there are so many more questions. I think if there's one takeaway from this panel, hopefully it's that this conversation is ongoing. So find outlets for those questions. If we have time, I don't want to speak for my fellow panelists, but I'll stay up here for a few more minutes and just talk to folks. Thank you for coming to this session. We're so grateful. And I also really want to thank our panelists who are not only sharing their expertise today, but doing the work every day. And so thank you so much.
Thank you, Lindsay.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you.